There we go, silence. I think before I introduce myself, let's start with a round of applause for our UK Top 75 this year. Okay, so to introduce myself, I'm Martin Guerreria. I'm Global BrandZ Research Director who look after the research side of BrandZ. And my presentation this morning is titled A Call to Arms for UK Brand Building for reasons which will become clear as I talk. But before we zoom in on the UK specifically, I thought it was worth just talking a little bit about BrandZ for those unfamiliar with BrandZ. So BrandZ is a huge and unique asset to Kantar and WPP, accessible to all of our agencies. And we've been gathering consumer interviews on brands, consumer opinions, consumer behaviour for more than 20 years now. And over the course of those 20 years, we've built a huge database. So that database now holds data on more than 3.5 million individuals, over 160,000 brands across a whole range of categories and more than 50 markets. So it's a huge and unique asset, and it can bring fantastic context to help with brand building across any category and any market, essentially. And of those 20 years, we've been valuing brands and conducting brand valuations for 14 years now, which again is a very long time. And again, for those of you unfamiliar, the way in which BrandZ's valuations are unique in the industry is there's no subjectivity with a BrandZ valuation. So our valuations team takes the financial side of the equation, which is publicly available, and combines that with the key ingredient, which is the view of the consumer from our BrandZ survey data, and that gives us a BrandZ brand value, essentially. And when you're looking at a BrandZ brand value, what that actually is the absolute dollar quantification of the intangible asset of brand, which sits in the mind of the consumer. So that's what a BrandZ brand value actually means in practice. And as I said, the critical step is that we're reflecting the view of the consumer, the changing view of the consumer, when we're producing our valuations, essentially. So we're going to zoom in on the UK now specifically, and given our venue and setting today, I was challenged a couple of days ago by a colleague, could I think of a movie that actually summarises the recent trajectory of UK brands, essentially? And unfortunately, the answer was obvious. It was this one. And you can probably surmise from this slide that actually my first few slides are not particularly positive, but I do promise to end on a much more positive note, and we've got another film reference at the end, which I'll encourage you to guess. But ultimately, there is a serious message here as well, and that is UK brands generally have not had a fantastic couple of years. So to the right of this slide, we've got the progress rate of the brand value of the UK top 75 in the last 12 months. And actually, overall, if we look at that group as an aggregate, there's actually been a decline in brand value of 3% when we look at the whole group. There are some exceptions, as we'll see a bit later, but as a whole, it's not great news, particularly if we put that into context versus the growth rate of the global economy, which is almost 4%, but also the progress of our globally most valuable brands. So BrandZ publishes a global top 100 every year, and year on year, those brands have grown by a massive 7%, so almost twice the rate of the global economy. And clearly, we're not seeing the same picture in the UK. And just to put the UK in context, we conduct brand valuations in a range of different markets, so 12 different markets in total now. And these are the top 30 average movements year on year for each market to allow a fair comparison. And you can see that a lot of these markets, brand value has actually improved for the collective of brands year on year. India, far and away, the fastest riser overall. At the bottom of the list, we've got South Africa. That's a market that's had huge financial problems recently, which explains that loss. Australia's had a big banking crisis recently, which has wiped a lot of value off their banks, which explains that. But you can see the UK is one of the few of only 3 of those 12 that haven't grown as a collective over the course of the last year. So not great news. But if we look at the profile of UK brands on a global stage, so within our global top 100, the number of UK brands that actually feature over the years is actually falling. So it peaked at 8 back in 2011, and now, if we fast forward to this year, we're down to just 3 UK brands represented in the global top 100, and those brands are our UK top 3, so Vodafone, Shell, and HSBC, essentially. So again, not great news. And if we fast forward, and this slide probably explains why I use the Titanic reference. So we've got the value of the UK's most valuable brand trended over time, which is the white line, and the value of the 100th most valuable global brand, which is the black line. And we can see those two lines are converging. The value of our global top 100 is increasing, and the value of our most valuable UK brand overall across any year is actually falling. So, sadly, by 2023, we're on track to have no UK brands represented in our global top 100, which again is not great news, and hopefully a bit of a wake-up call for brand building in the UK specifically. So why is that? How do we explain some of the problems and issues that we're seeing with UK brands? And we have a single number that we use to summarise the strength of a brand's equity, called brand power. And if we look at the aggregate brand power score of our top 10 most valuable global brands on the global stage, we can see a downturn. So declining brand equity is actually underpinning some of these problems that we're seeing. And clearly, as I said, today is about a call to arms to start investment again and investing in a savvy way to help address some of the declines that we've seen. So those of you who've worked with Kantar and BrandZ before will be familiar with our brand equity framework. So we talk about 3 key building blocks to build a successful brand. So being meaningful to consumers, which essentially means relevance with an emotional connection, being literally different to consumers, but also being salient to consumers. So coming readily to mind when consumers are in the purchase decision window, essentially. So this is some data from our global top 50 most valuable brands. And using that framework, let's look at how they perform. An average score, which is the grey shaded area, is 100. And we see as a collective, those 50 brands are very, very well known. They're very salient brands, but also they're very meaningfully different brands. So a strong score is around 110. So it's not only that our global top 50 are well known, they underpin that with relevance and difference, and that's really what's driving their growth overall. However, in our global top 100, we do see some brands that have declined in value in the last 12 months. And using the same framework, if we look at how they compare to the brands that have grown, they're just as salient. So our declining brands are just as well known, but they're not as meaningfully different. That engine room of growth is not as strong with those brands. So this concept of meaningful difference is really important to actually fuel brand growth, ultimately. Salience alone is not enough. So if we dial that back into the UK and look at our UK top 75 most valuable brands using the same lens, again, we see they are very salient brands. They're very well known. They're very famous, most of them. Some exceptions, but most of them. But as a collective, their meaningful difference is less than what we would expect. Remember, I said 110 is a barometer of a good performance. As a collective of brands, our top 75 is actually under that 110 mark. So we're saying there's an element of risk here. As a group, the UK top 75 brands are very famous and very well known, but don't necessarily have the meaningful difference to back that up and drive growth from this point. Clearly, as Bart has hinted at already, there are some mitigating factors in the UK at the moment. So we are living through times of austerity. We're all familiar with that. The political uncertainty looks like it's going to continue for a while yet, again, as Bart said. But if we put those two things together, there are certain areas that are being impacted by these trends. So an obvious one is consumers themselves. So consumer budgets are changing. Their needs are changing, what they want from brands, and also their behaviour is changing. But as all of you know only too well, at the same time, this environment is causing pressure on marketing budgets. There's more and more scrutiny around investment in brand building in the first place. So against that backdrop of pressure on consumers, pressure on the world of marketing, how have we seen those trends actually impact the UK brand building landscape? And there's 4 main trends I'm going to talk through. So one is around the high street. So just on the way in this morning, I was listening to the radio, and there was a stat that was hot off the press today that 16 shops on the UK high street are closing every day in the UK. So clearly the high street is suffering. It's an area that the industry and the marketing press has written about a lot recently, clearly. So what we did with the BrandZ database is look at a collection of brands you see here that have actually gone out of business in recent times and left the UK high street. Not all of them are UK brands, clearly. We've got Toys R Us on there. We've got Blockbuster on there as well. But if we look back to their last year of business and look at BrandZ data, we can see that their salience was on the wane. So they were under 100. Their profile was diminishing, clearly, because they were about to go out of business. But it gets really interesting when you look at how meaningfully different they were at the time. They were hugely more well-known than they were relevant to consumers and different to consumers. So without that engine room of growth, there was a real risk for them. And certainly looking at that data at the time, we would have been flagging the fact that, look, you are brands that need to work on your relevance, work on retaining your point of difference and communicating that to consumers because you're in an exposed position here, essentially. So, a little quiz for you. When I was doing that analysis, there was one brand that really jumped out to me. It was a brand that used to be on the UK high streets, was incredibly well known, but really, as you can see, lacked meaningful difference, which ultimately as I've charitably said, was a recipe for disaster, really, looking at that data. So any guesses as to what that brand might be? It wasn't on the previous slide, but it was included in the data. Any guesses? Come on, someone give me a brand. Woolworths is a good guess, but that was on the previous slide. HMV is a good guess, but no. Electrical territory, BHS, no. Comet, yes. So if we'd looked at that data at the time, we would have said there's a big problem here. You're very well known, you're very salient to consumers, but consumers are not seeing you as a relevant brand for their needs or understanding your point of difference versus the competition. So clearly, that was a problem for that brand that exited the high street shortly afterwards. But it's certainly not all doom and gloom. So we do see some exceptions. So by looking at the online fashion brands as a collective, so ASOS, Boohoo, Missguided and Very, their profile is very, very different, literally different. They're over-indexing on their difference. Consumers really see these brands as different, and they have this opportunity to build their relevance to a broader group and actually grow their salience at the same time. And the way these brands have done that is through a very personalised service, speed of response, a very strong range as well. But ultimately, they're delivering a fantastic brand experience, which we also know, using BrandZ data, is a real driver of growth. So it doesn't matter whether your brand is an online-only brand, offline-only brand, or a combination of the two, delivering consistency of brand experience is absolutely critical to growth. Second trend to talk about is the rise of what I've called the neobanks. So to the left of this slide, we've got the 9 banking brands that actually feature in our UK top 75 ranking. And if we look at their meaningful difference in salience, it's pretty average across the board. But we added Monzo to the study for the first time this year, and you can see the contrast. So clearly, not a huge brand in value terms yet, but incredibly different to consumers. And again, they have the opportunity to take that well-established point of difference and grow their meaningfulness, their relevance to consumers, as well as growing their salience at the same time. And if we look at the data for Monzo amongst younger consumers, we're actually seeing strong meaning and strong salience already. And already we're seeing that Monzo does better than those other banking brands in terms of their online and mobile perceptions amongst consumers, but also their distinctiveness. So I think the implications of this for all brands is within any category, even a relatively slow-moving one like banks, it's possible to build a brand very, very quickly. So the average age of the brands to the left is over 150 years. Monzo actually launched in 2015 and have established themselves very, very quickly. So that's an important message, but so is retaining and continuing to emphasize a point of difference. That is critical to defend from the competition, but also to defend from category disruptors, essentially. And then the third trend to talk about, the rise of the discounters within grocery. So going back to 2007, if we look at the average meaningful difference of the big four, so Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrison's, they were doing very, very well, indexing at a 134, really meeting consumer needs, communicating their point of difference. The discounter brands, Lidl and Aldi in the UK, massively under-indexed 10 years ago. But if we fast forward to the end of last year, we now see the meaningful difference of Lidl and Aldi is actually ahead slightly than the meaningful difference of the big four supermarkets. So again, it's evidence that these brands are growing, but they're growing by adapting to that changing consumer need. And the way that consumers talk about the discounter brands is they see them as strong innovators, they see them as brands that are very disruptive, but ultimately they are brands with clear momentum as well. And the implication for brands in any category is, yes, by all means, monitor your own brand, monitor your competitors, but it's crucial that your business is taking account of what's happening to consumer needs more generally and changing and amending your brand offer to actually make sure that you continue to meet those changing needs, because if you don't, somebody else absolutely will. And then the fourth and final trend is the growth of private label brands. So I've titled this slide Private Label to Private Brand, because clearly we're seeing private label brands becoming brands in their own right. And again, looking back 10 years, if we look at private label across a range of BrandZ FMCG categories as an aggregate group, we were seeing at the time they were not particularly well known. They were reasonably meaningful, but not an astronomically high score, and their potential for growth was under-indexing versus the typical UK brand. But again, if we fast forward 10 years and look at salience, meaningfulness and potential, all of those measures have grown hugely for private label. So private label brands are better known, but their meaning to consumers, their relevance to consumers has grown hugely, and actually they are now more likely to grow than the average UK brand. which clearly is a very changed landscape. So within FMCG, it's clear that just differentiating on quality alone is no longer enough. It's really important to build aspirations and build that emotional connection if your brand is going to succeed. And we've seen the well-publicised issues that Kraft Heinz has had in this space recently with some of their brands through that lack of investment. Okay, so what are the implications of all of this for UK brands specifically? And as I said, it's certainly not all doom and gloom. So as Bart mentioned earlier, there's a number of brands in our ranking that have had a very good 12 months, and these are our top 10 fastest rising brands in value terms. And the first thing you can see is it's quite an eclectic list. So this certainly suggests that the UK landscape is still a very fertile environment for growing and building brand value across any category, essentially. But what do those brands have in common? Well, if we look at those 10 fastest risers and their brand equity, they certainly tick the opportunity box. So they are currently much more meaningfully different than they are salient, which again is an opportunity for them to grow. They can improve that meaningful difference to consumers clearly, but it's quite interesting that they definitely fall into the same group as the likes of ASOS, etc., and have that opportunity to become even more meaningful to consumers as they grow their profile and become more salient as well. And digging a little bit deeper into those top 10 fastest risers, what do we see? What are they really known for by consumers? And two things that really jump out is they're known for the strength of their communications, which underlines the importance of continuing a dialogue with consumers clearly, but they're also known for their innovation credentials. We talked about the perceptions around innovation being important a couple of years ago, and these brands certainly, again, tick that box. And those two things together give them a very clear point of difference. They're perceived as leaders in their respective categories, and they clearly have this sense of momentum in the mind of consumers as well. So, Bart's shown you this number already, but just talking about innovation in more detail. So 3 years ago when we did our first event, we talked about the power of innovation to drive brand value, and now we're seeing that in our UK brand value figures. So if we look at the most innovative brands in perceptions terms 3 years ago and their pace of growth since then, they've actually grown by 9% in that intervening period, which when you remember that the total UK top 75 has actually declined by 3%, that's a really impressive achievement. But it's not just about innovative perceptions in the UK. We've also seen having a positive emotional connection with a brand, an affinity with a brand, is another driver of growth. So the brands that had that emotional connection 3 years ago are the brands that have seen the biggest brand value rise since then. So a combination of innovation credentials and an emotional connection is really important to fuel growth in the UK specifically. And then finally, to sum all that up, main message is ultimately the UK is still a very fertile environment for brand building. So this looks like a complicated trend slide, but it's really not. So the top blue line is the average share price of the BrandZ Top 75 portfolio since we launched our first ranking back at the end of 2017 up to today. Trended against the dark blue line is the FTSE 100 and how that's progressed over the same time period. And you can see the return on investment come 2019 is over 10%. So it's telling us that investing in brand is still a fantastic return for shareholders, and ultimately that investing in brand building should be seen as an investment, literally an investment, rather than a cost to business. And then to try and sum all that up in one slide, so what do we think are the crucial factors for successful brand building in the UK? We talked about innovation. So innovation will certainly help bring great brand experience, but keep your offer relevant as needs change. But also innovation in communications. We know marketing budgets are under pressure, and how we use those budgets is important. So one of our sessions today will talk about the importance of reaching consumers by as many touch points as possible to stand the best chance of building a brand. So innovation in communications is important as well. And ultimately, as we've seen, emphasising your point of difference and fostering that emotional connection is really important to grow brands in the UK too. So those are the key points from my presentation. I did promise to finish on another film reference. So there's some clues on this slide. So if you think of innovation as brain, if you think of communications as having the courage and being brave, and if you think of emotional connection as heart, so you've got brain, you've got courage, you've got heart. Any guesses? I can't believe you got it. The Wizard of Oz, yes. The Scarecrow lacked a brain. The Tin Man lacked a heart. The Lion thought at least he lacked courage. So all of those things are important, as we've talked about. But ultimately, my final message to you today, again, just to emphasise what Bart said up front, there's lots of great presentations from experts across Kantar today. So really, by tapping into that expertise, working with Kantar, we can work with you and partner to build great UK brands. Because as Dorothy said, after all, there's no place like home. Thank you. Thank you. And now for the next presentation, let me introduce Doreen Wang.